Today's daf is daf Samach, and we got up to Amar of Papa, which is 6 lines down from the top. Oved Kolchavim Adona. Okay, so there's an Adona and there's an Akuba. The Adona is the cask that holds a large volume of wine, and the Akuba is a small jug. And in the first scenario, the akum is pouring from the cask into the wine and into the jug that belongs to a Jew. So the question is, what's the status of that wine that's being poured into the jug? So Papa Paskins that Chamra Osir, that this is considered what we call kocho. You may remember that we spoke about the idea of kocho, that even if the akum doesn't touch the wine directly, but if it's coming into something else through the power and the energy force of the akum, that itself is as if he touched the wine. As the Gemara explains, my taima ki ka'asi mikoch oved kochovim ka'asi. The energy force of the akum, when he pours from the cask into the jug, is causing the wine to come down into the jug. And therefore it's as if he touched the wine directly, and therefore it is yayin nesech. Now here we have a tremendous confusion. And the issue at stake here is whether or not the yayin is not yayin nesech in the full sense of the term, and therefore it's also not only b'shtia, but even by no, you can't sell it, or it's only also b'shtia. And apparently, according to the Rosh at least, there are two different texts or manuscripts of Rashi that were passed down over the generations, and they contradict each other about this very point. Here, in our text of Rashi, Rashi says that the wine is osur even behana. Now, the problem with this Rashi, that the yayin nesech is osur behana, is that Rashi back on daf Nun Ches, just two blot before, when he discusses the case where the akum pours water into the wine of the Jew to dilute the wine, there Rashi says that the koach of the akum through the water that's being poured into the wine and now stirs up the wine only generates an Isur Shasiya, but not an Isur Hana. And L'chora, at the face of it, we would say Advarim Kal V'chomer. If in the case where he stirs the wine by pouring in the water to dilute the wine, Rashi says it's only Asur B'Shasiya, because presumably he's not interested in libations in front of the idol, and there is no idol here. And not only that, it's sort of like a second koach, because he's not touching the wine, he's only pouring the water into the wine. And yet Rashi says that in such a case, the wine is only asur b'shtia. Now, in our case, where he pours wine from the cask into the jug, then in a certain sense, he's even more far removed, because he's not doing anything to stir up the wine. He's just pouring wine into a jug. So how much more so in the case of the Adana and the Kuba, Rashi should be saying that it's only also v'shtir, because it's even more far removed than pouring in the water into the wine to dilute it, where Rashi says it's only also v'shtir. Not only that, but Rashi back on Daf Nun Ches also seems to indicate that the only time that we generate a full-fledged status of Yayin Nesach with an Iser Hana is only if the Akum came in contact with the wine. He actually touched the wine. Here he's only pouring the wine, he's not touching the wine. So the Rosh comes up with another Rashi. Again, this all has to do with manuscripts and so forth and so on. And according to that Rashi, the status of this wine in that version of Rashi is only an Isur Shasiyah and not an Isur Hana. And then it is reconcilable with that Rashi back on Nun Ches regarding the case of diluting the wine. Meaning in both cases, since he doesn't have, the idolater doesn't have direct contact, he doesn't touch the wine, therefore it's only also v'shasiyah. Now, why do I say this is like a balagan? It's very confusing because Tosas seems to go to the other extreme. And Tosas thinks that our case is more extreme, to the polar extreme lechumra, to make it into Yayin Nesach. So according to Tosas, it seems that when you compare these two sugyas, these two scenarios, one in which the akum dilutes the wine by adding water, and our case where he pours the wine, Tosas says this case of pouring the wine from the larger cask into the smaller jug is more yayin nesach. And Tosas explains why, because the act of pouring, again, when you pour wine, I'm not talking about diluting where you pour water into the wine. There are no libations to the idolatry with water. The libations are with wine. And we might even, again, if I'm permitted to say so, if we go back to the Beis Hamikdash, in the Beis Hamikdash itself, all libations were with wine. Okay, there's one exception on the last day of Sukkot, but okay, fine. In the case where here in our sugya, where the guy is pouring from a cask, that's an act of nisuch. And therefore, we have to raise the possibility, it should cross our minds, that maybe he's doing a libation of idolatry. And therefore, this is real makor yayin nesach. Now, Tosas is going to have to admit that it's not real makor yayin nesach, because we don't know that there's no idol here. In the presence of an idol, if the idolater pours wine in the presence of an idol, that's Avoda Zara. Here, there's no actual idol there. So we have to assume that maybe in his mind, he's doing this libation now when he's pouring the cask of wine for the idol. But anyway, just to summarize, there are just so many different possibilities here in terms of whether there should be an Isur Hana. On the one hand, we're saying it's a chiddush that it's even also b'shasiyah, because this is one darga, one notch less of yayin nesach than the case where he dilutes the wine. On the other extreme, we're saying no, fakir, it's more of a full-fledged status of yayin nesach with an Isur Hana than the case of dilution, because here it looks like he's doing an act of nisuch by pouring the wine. Okay, so this is all what I would call the Reisha, meaning the first statement of Rav Papa. And now we go on to the Sefer of Rav Papa. Yisrael Adonav Yod Kochav Makuva. Now it's just the opposite. The Jew is pouring from the cask, and the idol worship is holding on to a jug. And the Jew is pouring from this cask into the jug. Says Rav Papa, in this last case, Chamra Shari. The wine is permissible. It means that we have no havamina here that the guy is going to do a libation when he's on the receiving end, and it's the Jew who's pouring the wine into the jug. When do we have a fear of idol worship? That's imitzadei tzidudi osir. What happens is that the Yisrael is pouring from a large cask, a chavis, into, or called Adona, it's called here in the Lashon of the Shas, into this akuva of the guy. And the guy is trying to help him by moving the jug in a way that all the wine will go into the jug and none of it will spill on the ground to the left or to the right. By moving this around, he's in effect shaking the wine. And by shaking the wine, he's doing an act of nisuch. Rav Papa, now we have a different psak of Rav Papa. Hai ove kocham de dori zika. Now, the guy, the idol worshiper, is holding on to a leather flask which is tied with a knot. It's absolutely closed. The ka'azal Yisrael achore, the Jew is walking behind him, watching the guy. And now the question is the guy shaking up the flask and therefore shaking up the wine in the flask? Because we said that when he shakes up the wine, that's an act of libation. So that Rav Papa makes the following distinction. How much wine is in this flask that the guy is carrying in front of the Jew's behind? If it's filled to the top, then we can assume the lo makarkesh. He's not shaking up the flask because there's no room in the flask for the wine to move from space to space. The entire space of the jug, which in this course is called a flask, is completely occupied. So there's no room for shaking the wine around. But chasera, if on the other hand, the wine level in this flask is only limited and there's plenty of airspace in the flask, then it's also dilma mekarkesh. We might have a fear that the guy who's in front of the Jew, he's not afraid that the Jew behind him is looking at him, because after all, he's got a flask and he's not shaking it. So he thinks that while the Jew is distracted behind him, he's going to go ahead and shake up this flask. And now Rav Papa turns it around. Just one second. Yeah. Now he turns it around. Until now, he's been talking about Zika. Zika is a leather flask. The flask is tied, and therefore the only possibility of any sort of shaking of the wine inside the flask is if the flask is not full to the top. But now we move from Zika to a case of Kuba. Kuba, as we said before, is an open jug. It's not tied down. It's not closed. And here says Rav Papa, the halacha is just the opposite. Fakert. Malya, if the jug is filled to the top, asur. Why? Dilma naga. We have to be afraid that maybe because the jug is full to the top, the akum might actually touch the wine. And all this is going to happen, apparently, while he's carrying this jug that's full to the top, malya. So, if the jug is full to the top, the guy is concerned when he walks with the jug to move it around this way, move it around that way. And therefore, he may have touched the wine while he was repositioning the jug. However, kasera shari. If, on the other hand, the wine level in this jug is not all the way to the top, then Delo Naga, he would not touch the wine while he's walking. There's no reason to do so. He's got plenty of airspace. He doesn't have to worry about repositioning, the wine in the jug. So that's mutter. Now we might want to add that this case and this ruling of Rav Papa is referring to a case where the flask, which we called a zika, belongs to the Jew. And therefore the wine inside only becomes asur if either the idolater touches the wine or he shakes up the wine. So again, let's just go over this one more time. In the case of zika, where it's a closed flask, then if it's full to the top, it's mutter because there he can't shake up the wine inside of it. But if on the other hand we're talking about a zika, which is that jug, then we have to worry that maybe dafka because the jug is filled to the top, the guy might start touching the wine in the jug. However, Rav Ashi disagrees with the last ruling of Rav Papa, and he says Zika bein malyu bein chaseris shari. My time ain't derech nisuch bekach. So Rav Ashi adds another element into this equation, and he says that there's something called derech nisuch, where you shake up something up. The way that the idolaters would perform nisuch by shaking up the wine, according to Rav Ashi, is because they put their hand or a spoon directly into the wine and then they stir it with that spoon. They do not take a container that has wine in it and shake it about as part of the libations. Now, if the idolater is carrying an open jug of wine, then even Rav Ashi would agree that there's a serious problem over here. Because as we said before, in the last case of Rav Papa, When the Ovdei Kochom is holding onto an open jar, a jug of wine, then we're afraid he might put his hand inside of it, and then everybody agrees it's Yainus. Okay, we go on. Ma'atra Zara. Okay, now we have a wine press, and the way that the grapes are pressed down to remove that juice is by pushing a heavy beam, a wooden beam. Now, there are two ways to do that. One way is that the beam is lowered down onto the grapes when the akum stands on top of the beam. His weight will cause the beam to go down and crush the wine. The other option is that there's a pulley, meaning that the heavy planks of wood are suspended in midair, held up by this pulley with a rope, and the akum will loosen the rope, and that's how the plank falls down and the weight will crush and remove the juice from the grapes. Rav Papi Shari, Rav Ashi Vitem Rav Simbarasi also. Now the question is, what is the machlokas between Rav Papi and Rav Ashi? And here we have two Lashonos in the Gemara, so try to understand the two Lashonos. The kocho, if the method of crushing the grapes is because the akum climbs on top of the boards, the beams, and his weight will cause the beams to go down, that's called kocho. His weight is causing the juices to come out, and that's considered like he's taking out the juices with his hand. Is kuliyamalo pligido. So according to this lashon, it's what we call the lishna rishona, then everybody agrees that it's also. That's kocho. Ki pligi b'koach kocho. What about the case where the akum doesn't climb on top of the boards, the beams, and his weight brings it down, but rather he lowers the beam, so he's doing one action, and now the beams are actively coming down to crush the grapes. That's another action. That's called koach kocho, and that's the machlokas now between the two shitos. But Ika Diamri, according to the second Lishna, but koach kocho kliyamalo pligi deshari. There was never a machlokas about the pulley system, which is koach kocho, but ki pligi, they argue b'kocho. Only if he climbs on and the sheer weight will push down the planks and crush the grapes. Havi uvda v'koach kocho v'osar Rav Yaakov in our Pekod. So a case came up, and apparently the wine press of the Goyim was activated through that pulley system, and they paskin that it's us. And that, I believe, is how we paskin in Shulchan Aruch. Tosfos has another example of koach kocho in a different kind of a scenario of a wine press, where the screw is made to rotate by means of a horizontal pole that is threaded through the top of the screw. So the operator rotates the pole. In turn, that makes the screw rotate, which in turn lowers the beam, which in turn crushes the grapes. That's already koach kocho. Hahu chavita.